She looked like every other Gen Z kid with earbuds and a hoodie, sitting silently in seat 14A until catastrophic engine failure struck Flight 847 at 37,000 feet. When she calmly walked to the cockpit and said, "My call sign is Phoenix," everything changed. The F-22 pilots escorting them couldn't believe their ears. This wasn't just any teenager. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe. It was Thursday, March 14, 2024, and the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Denver International Airport's sprawling terminals. Flight 847, a United Airlines Boeing 777, was scheduled to depart at 2:45 p.m. for Norfolk International Airport in Virginia, a routine 4-hour journey across the heartland of America. Among the 298 passengers boarding at Gate B-27 sat 16-year-old Paisley McKnight, completely unremarkable in her faded jeans and navy hoodie. She had claimed a seat in the waiting area, earbuds in, scrolling through her phone like any other teenager killing time before a flight. Her backpack looked standard issue, stuffed with what appeared to be schoolbooks and snacks for the journey ahead. Nothing about Paisley suggested she was anything other than another high school student traveling alone, probably shuttling between divorced parents or heading to some East Coast boarding school. The other passengers barely glanced at her, and when they did, they saw exactly what she wanted them to see, just another Gen Z kid absorbed in her digital world, maybe a little more composed than most teens her age, but nothing that would make anyone look twice. A flight attendant named Carol, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, approached Paisley with the protective concern adults always showed unaccompanied minors. "Honey, are you traveling by yourself today?" she asked gently, her voice carrying that particular tone adults used when they encountered teenagers alone in airports. Paisley looked up, removing one earbud with practiced politeness that spoke of good upbringing. "Yes, ma'am. I have my boarding pass right here," she replied, her voice steady and mature beyond her years. Carol smiled warmly, noting how the girl didn't seem nervous or fidgety like most kids her age would be. "Of course. Flying to see family in Virginia?" Paisley's expression flickered for just a moment, so briefly that Carol almost missed it. "Something like that," she answered quietly, then slipped her earbud back in, signaling the conversation was over in that polite but firm way that suggested she wasn't interested in small talk. As boarding began at 2:15 p.m., Paisley joined the line with the other passengers, her movements economical and purposeful. She had lucked into seat 14A, a window seat in the middle section of the aircraft that would give her a clear view of the sky and ground below. The Boeing 777 was nearly packed as passengers settled in for the cross-country flight, business people checking emails, families organizing carry-ons, college students already napping. Paisley buckled herself in and pulled out what looked like a standard tablet, but anyone paying close attention might have noticed the screen displayed complex aircraft systems diagrams rather than TikTok or Instagram. She quickly switched to a music app when Janet Morrison, a chatty middle-aged woman from Denver, settled into the middle seat beside her. "Oh, how exciting. A young traveler," Janet exclaimed as she struggled to stuff her oversized purse under the seat. "Are you going to college visits? My daughter did that when she was your age. Visited like 12 schools." Paisley offered a polite smile and nodded non-committally. "Something like that," she said, using her standard response for nosy adults. Janet, undeterred by the teenager's obvious disinterest in conversation, continued chattering about her daughter's college experience while Paisley gazed out the window at the ground crew preparing the massive aircraft for departure. What Janet and the other passengers couldn't possibly know was that Paisley McKnight was analyzing everything she saw with the trained eye of someone who had been studying aircraft systems since she could read. As the ground crew performed their pre-flight checks, she mentally cataloged each procedure, noting the fuel truck's positioning, the baggage handler's efficiency, and the way the pilots conducted their exterior inspection. Her father had taught her that situational awareness wasn't just important in combat, it was crucial everywhere, always. Captain Jake Morrison and First Officer Lisa Chen completed their pre-flight checklist in the cockpit, unaware that one of their passengers possessed more knowledge about their aircraft than most commercial pilots. Paisley had memorized the Boeing 777 systems manual years ago, along with emergency procedures that most flight crews only reviewed during recurrent training. It wasn't that she was some kind of prodigy, it was simply what happened when you grew up in a military aviation family where excellence wasn't just expected, it was a matter of survival. The engine spooled up at exactly 2:43 p.m., and Flight 847 pushed back from the gate right on schedule. As they taxied toward runway 34R, Paisley felt the familiar thrill she always experienced during takeoff. But this wasn't the excitement of a typical teenager on vacation. It was the deep, bone-level understanding of flight that came from having aviation fuel in her veins instead of blood. Her phone buzzed with a text from her Aunt Sarah. "Safe travels, sweetheart. Your dad would be so proud of who you're becoming." Paisley's throat tightened as she quickly typed back a thumbs-up emoji and tucked the phone away. At 2:58 p.m., Flight 847 lifted off into the clear Colorado sky, climbing steadily through 10,000 feet as Denver fell away below. Paisley pressed her face to the window, watching the landscape transform from urban sprawl to the vast emptiness of eastern Colorado. She was mentally calculating their flight path, northeast toward Nebraska, then across Iowa and Illinois, finally southeast toward Virginia, when Janet tried again to strike up a conversation. "So what kind of music do you listen to?" Janet asked, gesturing at Paisley's earbuds. "My daughter's always trying to get me to listen to that Taylor Swift. Do you like her?" Paisley turned from the window, her expression polite but distant. "I listen to a little bit of everything," she said diplomatically. What she didn't mention was that her playlist was mostly instrumental music that helped her concentrate while studying tactical manuals, or that she found most pop music too emotionally messy for her analytical mind. The flight attendants began their service as they reached cruising altitude at 37,000 feet. The aircraft settled into its smooth eastward journey across the American heartland. Carol, the flight attendant who had spoken to Paisley at the gate, paused by row 14 with her cart. "What can I get you to drink, sweetheart?" she asked warmly. "Just water, please," Paisley replied, accepting the small plastic cup with a quiet "thank you" that impressed Carol with its genuine politeness. So many teenagers these days barely looked up from their phones, but this girl had manners that suggested good parenting. If Carol had known the truth, she would have understood that Paisley's composed behavior wasn't just good manners, it was military bearing inherited through generations of distinguished service. The McKnight name carried weight in naval aviation circles, though Paisley's legendary call sign Phoenix had died with her father 3 years ago in a training accident that still haunted her dreams. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Phoenix McKnight had been one of the most respected Top Gun instructors at NAS Fallon, known for producing pilots who could handle anything the sky threw at them. His sudden death had left Paisley as the sole keeper of family traditions that stretched back to World War II, when her great-grandfather had flown Corsairs in the Pacific. 3 hours into the flight, as they crossed into Missouri airspace, Paisley was deep in what appeared to be a teenage novel but was actually a translated Russian manual on electronic warfare tactics when the first sign of trouble appeared. She noticed it before anyone else, a subtle change in the engine's harmonics, barely perceptible unless you knew what to listen for. Her father had taught her that aircraft spoke to those who knew their language, and this Boeing was telling her something was wrong. The slight vibration in her seat confirmed her suspicions. She glanced around the cabin, noting that other passengers were still absorbed in their movies and conversations, completely oblivious. Even the flight attendants hadn't noticed yet. But Paisley's trained senses, honed by years of studying her father's debriefing tapes and maintenance logs, picked up the telltale signs of trouble brewing in the aircraft systems. At 5:47 p.m. Central Time, as Flight 847 flew over the farmlands of central Illinois, Captain Morrison felt it too. "You getting that vibration, Lisa?" he asked his first officer quietly, not wanting to alarm the passengers. First Officer Chin nodded grimly as she scanned her instruments. "Engine parameters are still normal, but something's definitely off," she replied, her voice tight with concern. They were still an hour and a half from Norfolk, flying over rural areas with limited emergency landing options. The crisis escalated quickly. At 5:52 p.m., a loud bang echoed through the cabin, followed by a violent shudder that sent drinks flying and passengers grabbing their armrests. The aircraft lurched to the left, and Paisley felt the familiar sensation of thrust asymmetry. One engine was failing. While other passengers screamed and Janet clutched her seat in terror, Paisley was already calculating. Based on their current position over Springfield, Illinois, and the Boeing 777's glide ratio, they had approximately 18 minutes of controlled flight time if they lost both engines completely. Captain Morrison's voice came over the intercom, steady but tense. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some mechanical difficulties and will be making an emergency landing at Lambert St. Louis International Airport. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened while our flight crew prepares the cabin." What he didn't announce was that their left engine had just suffered a catastrophic failure, sending metal fragments through hydraulic lines and compromising their flight controls. Carol rushed down the aisle, her earlier warmth replaced by professional urgency as she began preparing passengers for an emergency landing. When she reached row 14, she was surprised to find Paisley calmly helping Janet put on her life vest correctly. "Honey, are you okay?" Carol asked, expecting to find another terrified teenager. Instead, Paisley looked up with eyes that seemed far too old for her 16-year-old face. "I'm fine," she said quietly. "But you might want to check the passengers in rows 8 through 12. That woman in 9C looks like she's having a panic attack, and the man in 11A appears to be having chest pains." Carol stared at her for a moment, struck by the girl's composure and situational awareness, then hurried forward to check on the passengers Paisley had identified. She found both exactly as described, the woman hyperventilating and the man clutching his chest. How had a teenager noticed what she, a flight attendant with 15 years of experience, had missed? In the cockpit, Captain Morrison and First Officer Chen were fighting for their lives. The engine failure had triggered a cascade of system failures that were overwhelming their ability to maintain controlled flight. "I'm losing hydraulics on System A," Chen reported, her voice tight with concentration. "Backup systems are compensating, but we're down to manual reversion on primary flight controls." Morrison nodded grimly as he wrestled with the controls, feeling the aircraft's increasing reluctance to respond to his inputs. What neither pilot knew was that their radio communications were being monitored by NORAD's Colorado Springs facility, where the mention of a commercial airliner in distress had triggered automatic protocols. Within minutes, 2 F-22 Raptors from the 1st Fighter Wing at Joint Base Langley Eustis were scrambled to provide assistance and assessment of Flight 847's emergency. Major Sarah Viper Rodriguez and Captain Mike Torch Williams were airborne within 6 minutes of the alert, their stealth fighters climbing rapidly toward the stricken airliner's position. "Control, Viper and Torch are airborne, proceeding to intercept United 847, Rodriguez reported as they accelerated through Mach 1.2. ETA to target 6 minutes. Back aboard Flight 847, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. A second bang, smaller but more ominous than the first, told Paisley that they were now dealing with multiple system failures. She could feel the aircraft's sluggish response to the pilot's inputs, and her mental calculations told her they were losing altitude faster than a controlled descent should allow. They needed help and they needed it soon. Janet was crying softly beside her, clutching her phone as she tried to call her daughter. "I can't get through," she sobbed. "The call won't go through." Paisley gently took the phone from her hands. "We're too high for cell towers and the aircraft's Wi-Fi systems are probably compromised," she explained calmly. "But the pilots have multiple radio systems. They're already in contact with air traffic control and emergency services." Janet looked at her with surprise. "How do you know all that?" she asked through her tears. Paisley hesitated for a moment, then decided the situation was serious enough to warrant honesty. "My family has been in aviation for a long time," she said simply. "I know a little about how these things work." What she didn't say was that she had been studying emergency procedures since she was 12 years old, poring over her father's training materials and accident reports with the intensity of a graduate student. She had memorized every major commercial aviation disaster of the past 30 years, analyzing what had gone wrong and what could have been done differently. It was her way of honoring her father's memory and preparing herself to carry on the family tradition of military aviation excellence. At 6:01 p.m., the F-22 Raptors made visual contact with Flight 847. "Control, Viper has eyes on United 847, Major Rodriguez reported. "Aircraft appears to be trailing fluid from the left engine nacelle, and I can see visible damage to the wing structure. They're in a shallow descent, approximately 31,000 feet and descending." Captain Williams, flying formation off her right wing, added his own observations. "Torch confirms visual. Aircraft flight path appears unstable with visible control inputs. Recommend immediate diversion to nearest suitable airport." The air traffic controller's voice crackled through their headsets. "Viper and Torch, United 847 is attempting emergency landing at Lambert Field, but they're reporting multiple system failures and possible loss of control authority. Stand by for possible emergency communications relay." Inside the cockpit of Flight 847, Captain Morrison was running out of options. "Lisa, I think we're going to lose this bird," he said quietly, not wanting the passengers to hear his assessment over the intercom. "The hydraulics are failing faster than the backups can compensate, and I'm getting flight control warnings across the board." First Officer Chin nodded grimly as she worked through emergency checklists with mechanical precision. "Should we declare Mayday?" "Already did," Morrison replied, his hands steady on the controls despite the sweat beading on his forehead. "But I don't think Lambert's going to work. We're losing altitude too fast, and the controls are getting mushier by the minute. We need alternatives. It was then that Paisley McKnight made a decision that would change everything. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, ignoring Janet's protests and Carol's sharp command to remain seated. "I need to talk to the pilots," she said firmly, her voice carrying an authority that seemed impossible for someone her age. Carol moved to block her path. "Honey, you need to sit down right now. We're in an emergency situation." "That's exactly why I need to talk to them," Paisley replied, her composure unshakable even as the aircraft shuddered around them. "I know things about this aircraft that might help." Carol stared at her, something in the teenager's tone making her hesitate. There was no panic in those young eyes, no fear, just the steady confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. "What could you possibly know that our pilots don't?" Carol asked, but even as she said it, she was remembering the girl's earlier observations about the distressed passengers, her calm demeanor in the face of crisis, her knowledge about communication systems. Paisley met her gaze steadily. "More than you might think," she said quietly. "My call sign is Phoenix." The effect of those words was immediate and electric. Carol's eyes widened as she recognized the legendary call sign, even if she didn't fully understand its significance. Phoenix was a name whispered with reverence in military aviation circles, belonging to a family whose tactical brilliance and sacrifice had shaped naval aviation for 3 generations. The original Phoenix had been a World War II ace, his son had flown in Vietnam, and his grandson had been one of the most respected Top Gun instructors before his tragic death 3 years ago. "You're Marcus McKnight's daughter," Carol whispered, the pieces suddenly falling into place. The composure, the knowledge, the bearing that seemed too mature for a teenager, it all made sense now. Paisley nodded once, sharply, in the military manner her father had taught her. "And right now this aircraft needs every advantage it can get." Carol stepped aside without another word, and Paisley walked forward through the cabin with the steady gait of someone accustomed to moving under extreme conditions. Passengers watched her pass with confusion and growing curiosity. Who was this teenager who seemed so calm while everyone else was terrified? Janet called after her, "Paisley, what's going on? Where are you going?" But Paisley was already at the cockpit door, knocking with the precise rhythm her father had taught her, the universal signal among military aviators that meant friendly coming aboard. Captain Morrison looked up from his instruments as Carol's voice came over the intercom. "Captain, there's a passenger here who says she can help. She's..." Carol paused, still processing what she had learned. "She's Phoenix's daughter, sir." The effect on Morrison was immediate. Every military pilot knew the Phoenix call sign, knew the family's legendary contributions to aviation. If Marcus McKnight's daughter was on his aircraft, and if she thought she could help, he was damn well going to listen. "Send her in," he said without hesitation, and moments later Paisley McKnight stepped into the cockpit of Flight 847. At 16, she looked impossibly young among the sophisticated instruments and controls, but her eyes swept the panel with the trained assessment of someone who had been studying aircraft systems her entire life. "What's your status, Captain?" she asked, her voice steady and professional. Morrison quickly briefed her on their situation, the engine failure, the hydraulic problems, the degrading flight controls, and their diminishing options for emergency landing sites. Paisley listened without interruption, her mind processing the information and cross-referencing it with years of study and her father's teachings about crisis management. "Have you considered Scott Air Force Base?" she asked finally. "It's about 40 miles east of Lambert, but they have longer runways and full emergency response capabilities. Plus, they're equipped to handle military aircraft, which means they understand complex emergencies." First Officer Chen looked up from her checklist with surprise. "How do you know about Scott?" she asked. Paisley's expression remained calm. "I've studied every major airfield within 200 miles of our current position," she said simply. "It's what my family does, we prepare for every contingency." What she didn't mention was that she had memorized the runway specifications, approach patterns, and emergency procedures for dozens of airports across the country, driven by an almost obsessive need to be prepared for any situation that might arise in the sky her father had loved so much. Captain Morrison was already reaching for his radio. "That's brilliant thinking," he said, his respect for the teenager growing by the moment. "Chin, get me Scott Air Force Base approach control." As his first officer worked to establish contact, Morrison turned back to Paisley. "What else do you see that we might have missed?" Paisley studied the instrument panel with the focused intensity she had inherited from generations of military aviators. "Your backup hydraulic system is showing intermittent pressure fluctuations," she observed, pointing to a gauge that was flickering between normal and low readings. That suggests you might have a slow leak in the B system lines, probably caused by debris from the engine failure. If that system fails completely, you'll lose your remaining flight control authority. The two pilots exchanged glances, both impressed and slightly unnerved by the teenager's technical knowledge. How do you know all this? Chen asked, but Morrison was already implementing Paisley's recommendations, adjusting their flight path towards Scott Air Force Base while monitoring the hydraulic systems more closely. Outside the aircraft, Major Rodriguez and Captain Williams maintained their protective formation around Flight 847, ready to assist with communications or emergency escort if needed. Control, Viper reporting United 847 has altered course towards Scott Air Force Base, Rodriguez radioed. Aircraft appears to be under control but maintaining emergency status. It was then that everything changed. A new voice came over the emergency frequency, young and clear and impossibly calm for someone aboard a crippled aircraft. Scott approach, this is Phoenix aboard United 847. We're currently descending through 28,000 feet with multiple system failures and requesting emergency approach clearance to runway 12R. The effect on the F-22 pilots was instantaneous and profound. Both Rodriguez and Williams had grown up hearing stories of the legendary Phoenix call sign, had studied the tactical innovations and heroic sacrifices of the McKnight family throughout their own training. The original Phoenix had shot down 7 Japanese aircraft over the Pacific, his son had performed impossible rescue missions in Vietnam, and Marcus Phoenix, McKnight had been a legend among Top Gun instructors before his death. Control, did that transmission just come from Phoenix? Williams asked over the tactical frequency, his voice tight with emotion. Rodriguez was equally stunned. That call sign has been retired since Commander McKnight's death, she radioed back. Who's using it? The air traffic controller's voice was equally puzzled. Unknown aircraft identifying as Phoenix, please clarify your position and authority to use that call sign. Paisley's response was calm and matter-of-fact. Scott approach, Phoenix is aboard United 847 as passenger. Call sign inherited through family lineage. Currently assisting flight crew with emergency procedures. The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity to everyone listening. Then Major Rodriguez's voice cut through the static, filled with a respect and awe that transcended military protocol. Phoenix, this is Viper and Torch in F-22 escort formation. We have you visual and are honored to fly with Phoenix call sign again. How can we assist? Inside the cockpit of Flight 847, Captain Morrison and First Officer Chen stared at Paisley with new understanding. This wasn't just a knowledgeable teenager helping out in an emergency, this was aviation royalty, the inheritor of a legacy that stretched back 3 generations of distinguished service. Paisley keyed the radio again, her voice carrying the weight of that heritage. Viper and Torch, Phoenix acknowledges. Request you coordinate with Scott approach for emergency landing sequence. We're going to need full emergency response on the ground. Roger Phoenix, already coordinating, Rodriguez replied. Be advised, your father trained half the pilots in our squadron. It's an honor to provide escort for Phoenix call sign. Those words hit Paisley like a physical blow, threatening to crack the composure she had maintained throughout the crisis. For a moment, her 16-year-old vulnerability showed through the military bearing she had inherited. Her father had touched so many lives, had trained so many pilots who were now serving around the world, and yet he was gone, leaving her as the sole carrier of the Phoenix legacy. But she pushed the emotion down, the way he had taught her, and focused on the task at hand. Thank you, Viper, she said quietly. Let's bring this bird home. Captain Morrison looked at her with something approaching awe. Your father would be proud, he said softly, and Paisley nodded once sharply before turning back to the instruments. The approach to Scott Air Force Base was harrowing. With partial flight controls and failing hydraulics, Morrison had to use every bit of his skill and experience to keep the Boeing 777 stable as they descended through the Illinois sky. Paisley remained in the cockpit, calling out readings from instruments the pilots couldn't monitor while flying manually, her voice steady and professional despite the extreme circumstances. Hydraulic pressure holding at 60%, she reported as they passed through 15,000 feet. Backup systems still responding, but I'm seeing fluctuations in the B system that suggest we're on borrowed time. Captain Chin, sweat beading on her forehead as she worked through emergency checklists, looked over at the teenager with amazement. Where did you learn to read these systems like this? Paisley's answer was simple. My father's study. I've been reading technical manuals since I was 10 years old. What she didn't say was that those late nights in her father's study, surrounded by flight manuals and tactical documents, had been her way of staying close to him after his death. Every procedure she memorized, every system she understood, was another connection to the legacy he had left behind. At 10,000 feet, the aircraft shuddered violently as the remaining hydraulic system began to fail. Morrison fought the controls as the Boeing 777 became increasingly difficult to maneuver. "We're losing it," he said grimly. "Control authority is down to maybe 30%. Paisley studied the instrument panel with laser focus, her mind racing through options her father had taught her to consider when facing seemingly impossible situations. "Captain, what if we use differential thrust for steering?" she suggested. "The right engine is still producing full power. If we reduce thrust on approach and use power adjustments for directional control, we might be able to maintain heading even with compromised hydraulics." Morrison's eyes widened as he processed her suggestion. It was an advanced technique used primarily in military applications, something most commercial pilots had never attempted. "That's incredibly dangerous," First Officer Chin said, but Morrison was already considering it. "It's also brilliant," he admitted. "Phoenix, have you ever seen this technique used?" Paisley nodded. "My father demonstrated it during emergency training scenarios. It requires precise timing and coordination, but it's possible." She didn't mention that she had spent countless hours studying her father's training videos, memorizing every technique he had used to bring damaged aircraft home safely. The F-22 escorts maintained their protective formation as Flight 847 began its final approach to Scott Air Force Base. "Phoenix, Viper here," Major Rodriguez called over the radio. "Scott approach has cleared the runway and positioned full emergency response teams. Fire and rescue are standing by, and medical teams are ready for passenger evacuation if needed." "Roger, Viper," Paisley responded, her voice calm despite the desperate situation unfolding around her. "Phoenix appreciates the escort. My father always said that having fellow warriors watching your six makes all the difference." Rodriguez felt her throat tighten at those words. Marcus McKnight had indeed been a warrior in the truest sense, and his daughter was proving herself worthy of the Phoenix call sign in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The final approach was a masterpiece of aviating skill combined with inherited tactical knowledge. Captain Morrison used differential thrust exactly as Paisley had suggested, reducing power on the functioning engine and using thrust adjustments to maintain directional control as the Boeing 777 descended toward the runway at Scott Air Force Base. Paisley called out altitude and airspeed readings with the precision of an experienced flight engineer, her voice never wavering even as the aircraft bucked and shuddered in its death throes. 500 feet, airspeed 140 knots, descent rate 800 feet per minute, she reported. "Hydraulics are at critical levels, but backup systems are still responding." Morrison nodded grimly, his hands steady on the controls as he fought to keep the massive aircraft aligned with the runway. "Phoenix, I need you to monitor engine parameters and call out any changes immediately," he said. "If we lose that right engine now, we're done." "Roger, Captain," Paisley replied, her eyes locked on the engine instruments with unwavering focus. Around them, the cockpit was filled with warning alarms and flashing lights, but she filtered out the noise and concentrated on the critical systems that would determine whether they lived or died in the next few minutes. Engine parameters stable, hydraulic pressure holding at minimum operational levels. At 200 feet above the runway, disaster struck one final time. The aircraft's remaining hydraulic system finally gave up completely, and Morrison found himself holding the controls of a 300-ton aircraft with no flight control authority except engine thrust. "That's it," he said, his voice tight with concentration. "We're committed now. Phoenix, I need you to help me with power settings. Call out thrust levels as I adjust." What happened next would be talked about in aviation circles for decades to come. Working together with perfect coordination, Captain Morrison and 16-year-old Paisley McKnight brought United Flight 847 to a safe landing using only differential engine thrust and the aircraft's remaining momentum. Paisley's voice remained calm and professional throughout the final approach, calling out power settings and maintaining situational awareness while Morrison performed what many would later call one of the most skillful emergency landings in commercial aviation history. 50 feet, thrust at 40%, rate of descent 600 feet per minute, Paisley reported as the runway rose to meet them. 30 feet, maintain current power setting, looking good, Captain. The Boeing 777 touched down hard but safely on Scott Air Force Base's runway 12 at 6:23 p.m. Central Time, nearly 4 hours after departing Denver. Emergency vehicles immediately surrounded the aircraft as Morrison brought it to a stop, their sirens and flashing lights creating a chaotic scene of organized rescue response. As the engines wound down and the aircraft came to its final rest, Captain Morrison turned to Paisley with profound respect. "Phoenix, I don't know how to thank you," he said quietly. "Without your knowledge and assistance, I'm not sure we would have made it." Paisley's composure finally cracked slightly, the adrenaline of the past hour catching up with her. "You would have found a way, Captain," she said, her voice softer now. "Good pilots always do. My father taught me that." The passenger evacuation was swift and orderly, with emergency slides deployed and rescue teams assisting everyone off the aircraft. Passengers who had dismissed Paisley as just another teenager now looked at her with amazement and respect as word spread through the cabin about her role in saving their lives. Janet Morrison, still shaky from the ordeal, grabbed Paisley's hand as they reached the bottom of the emergency slide. "You saved us all, didn't you?" she said, tears streaming down her face. "That quiet girl in 14A? You're not just any teenager." Paisley squeezed her hand gently. "I'm just someone who was taught to help when help is needed," she replied modestly. "It's what my family does." As the passengers were processed by emergency responders and airline officials, Major Rodriguez and Captain Williams landed their F-22 Raptors at Scott Air Force Base to meet the young woman who had honored the Phoenix call sign under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. When they found Paisley in the passenger processing area, still wearing her faded jeans and hoodie but now surrounded by airline officials and emergency personnel, they approached with the respect due to a fellow warrior. "Phoenix," Major Rodriguez said formally, extending her hand. "Major Sarah Rodriguez, call sign Viper. It was an honor to fly escort for you today." Captain Williams stepped forward as well. "Captain Mike Williams, Torch. Your father trained my squadron commander at Fallon. He would be incredibly proud of what you accomplished today." Paisley shook their hands with the firm grip her father had taught her, her composure restored now that the immediate crisis had passed. "Thank you both for the escort," she said. "Having you up there made all the difference." Rodriguez smiled. "That's what wingmen are for, Phoenix. Always." As the sun set over Scott Air Force Base, painting the Illinois sky in shades of orange and gold, Paisley McKnight stood on the tarmac looking back at United Flight 847. The aircraft that had carried 298 people safely to the ground despite catastrophic mechanical failures would never fly again, but everyone aboard had survived thanks to the skill of its pilots and the inherited tactical knowledge of a 16-year-old girl who carried one of the most respected call signs in military aviation history. Carol, the flight attendant who had first spoken to Paisley at Denver International, approached her with tears in her eyes. "I've been flying for 15 years, she said softly, "and I've never seen anything like what you did today. Your composure, your knowledge, it was extraordinary." Paisley looked back at the damaged aircraft one more time, thinking about her father and the legacy he had entrusted to her. "It's what Phoenix means," she said quietly. "Rising from the ashes, finding a way when there seems to be no way. My father lived that every day and he taught me that sometimes ordinary people have to do extraordinary things." Carol nodded, understanding now why the teenager had seemed so different from other young passengers she had encountered. Later that evening, as Paisley waited for her connecting flight to Norfolk, courtesy of United Airlines who wanted to ensure their youngest hero reached her destination safely, she received a text message that made her smile for the first time since the crisis began. It was from the commander of VFA-11, the Navy squadron her father had helped train. "Phoenix, heard about your actions today. Your father's legacy lives on. Hoo-yah." As she settled into her new seat for the final leg of her journey, Paisley reflected on the day's events. She had revealed her identity and capabilities in a way she never intended, but she had also honored the Phoenix call sign in the most meaningful way possible, by saving lives and demonstrating the tactical excellence that had been passed down through 3 generations of military aviators. The other passengers on her connecting flight looked at her with curiosity and respect, some recognizing her from news reports that were already spreading about the teenage hero who had helped save United Flight 847. But Paisley just put her earbuds back in and gazed out the window at the stars appearing in the darkening sky, thinking about her father and the proud tradition she now carried forward. She was no longer just the quiet girl in seat 14A. She was Phoenix, and the sky itself had recognized her claim to that legendary call sign. Tomorrow she would arrive in Norfolk to visit the Naval Air Station where her father had taught so many pilots to be their best when the stakes were highest. Tonight, she was content to know that she had honored his memory and proven herself worthy of the name that meant everything to her family. The Phoenix had risen from the ashes once again, carried by the wings of a 16-year-old girl who had shown the world that sometimes the most extraordinary capabilities come in the most unexpected packages. And somewhere in the vast expanse of the American sky, the spirit of Lieutenant Commander Marcus Phoenix McKnight flew alongside his daughter, proud beyond measure of the warrior she was becoming.